Welcome to the Folktale Project. This is Dan Scholz. Today we have the fourth tale from the story of Waverley, Here and There Among the Heather. And at this point, these stories are going to become much longer, but we're going to have some really fun interludes that come in between. So here we are. Edward has, found himself out and about in the world once again, on his way to Perth, and we're going to see exactly what happens to him. Not long after Callum Beg had been left behind, and indeed almost as soon as the innkeeper and Edward were fairly on their way, the former suddenly announced that his horse had fallen lame, and that they must turn aside to a neighbouring smithy to have the matter attended to. And, as it is the fast day, and the smith is a religious man, it may cost your honour as muckle as a sixpence a shoe, suggested the wily innkeeper, watching Edward's face as he spoke. For this announcement Edward cared nothing. He would gladly have paid a shilling a nail to be allowed to push forward on his journey with all speed. Accordingly, to the smithy of Cairnvreckan they went. The village was in an uproar. The smith, a fierce-looking man, was busy hammering dogs' heads for musket-locks, while among the surrounding crowd the names of great Highland chiefs, Clanronald, Glengarry, Lochiel, and that of Vickianvor himself, were being bandied from mouth to mouth. Edward soon found himself surrounded by an excited mob, in the midst of which the smith's wife, a wild, witch-like woman, was dancing, every now and then casting her child up in the air as high as her arms would reach, singing all the while, and trying to anger the crowd, and especially to infuriate her husband, by the Jacobite songs which she chanted. At last the smith could stand this provocation no longer. He snatched a red-hot bar of iron from the forge and rushed at his wife, crying out loud that he would thrust it down her throat. Then, finding himself held back by the crowd from executing vengeance on the woman, all his anger turned upon Edward, whom he took to be a Jacobite emissary. For the news which had caused all this stir was that Prince Charles had landed, and that the whole Highlands was rallying to his banner. So fierce and determined was the attack which the angry smith of Cairnvreckan made on Edward that the young man was compelled to draw his pistol in self-defence. And, as the crowd threatened him and the smith continued furiously to attack with the red-hot iron, almost unconsciously his finger pressed the trigger. The shot went off, and immediately the smith fell to the ground. Then Edward, borne down by the mob, was for some time in great danger of his life. He was saved at last by the interference of the minister of the parish, a kind and gentle old man, who caused Edward's captors to treat him more tenderly, so that instead of executing vengeance upon the spot, as they had proposed, they brought him before the nearest magistrate, who was indeed an old military officer, and, in addition, the laird of the village of Cairnvreckan, one Major Melville by name. The latter proved to be a stern soldier, so severe in manner that he often became unintentionally unjust. Major Melville found that though the blacksmith's wound proved to be a mere scratch, and though he had to own that the provocation given was a sufficient cause for Edward's hasty action, yet he must detain the young man prisoner upon the warrant issued against Edward Waverley, which had been sent out by the Supreme Court of Scotland. Edward, who at once owned to his name, was astonished beyond words to find that not only was he charged with being in the company of actual rebels, such as the Baron of Bradwardine and Vickianvor, but also with trying to induce his troop of horse to revolt by means of private letters addressed to one of them, Sergeant Houghton, in their barracks at Dundee. Captain Waverley was asserted to have effected this through the medium of a pedlar named Will Ruthian, or Wily Will, whose very name Edward had never heard up to that moment. As the magistrate's examination proceeded, Waverley was astonished to find that instead of clearing himself, everything he said, every article he carried about his person, was set down by Major Melville as additional proof of his complicity with the treason. Among these figured Flora's verses, his own presence at the great hunting match among the mountains, his father's and Sir Everard's letters, even the huge manuscripts written by his tutor, of which he had never read 6 pages, were all brought forward as to so many evidences of his guilt. Finally, the magistrate informed Edward that he would be compelled to detain him a prisoner, in his house of Cairnvreckan, but that if he would furnish such information as it was doubtless in his power to give concerning the forces and plans of Vickian Vor and the other Highland chiefs, he might, after a brief detention, be allowed to go free. Edward fiercely exclaimed that he would die rather than turn informer against those who had been his friends and hosts, whereupon, having refused all hospitality, he was conducted to a small room, there to be guarded till there was a chance of sending him under escort to the castle of Stirling. Here he was visited by Mr. Morton, the minister who had saved him from the clutches of the mob, and so sympathetically and kindly did he speak that Edward told him his whole story from the moment when he had first left Waverley Honour. And though the minister's favourable report did not alter the opinion Major Melville had formed of Edward's treason, it softened his feelings toward the young man so much that he invited him to dinner, and afterwards did his best to procure him favourable treatment from the Westland Whig captain, Mr. Gifted Gilfillan, who commanded the party which was to convey him to Stirling Castle. The escort which was to take Edward southward was not so strong as it might have been. Part of Captain Gifted Gilfillan's command had stayed behind to hear a favourite preacher upon the occasion of the afternoon feast-day service at Cairnvreckan. Others straggled for purposes of their own, while, as they went along, their leader lectured Edward upon the fewness of those that should be saved. Heaven, he informed Edward, would be peopled exclusively by the members of his own denomination. Captain Gifted was still engaged in condemning all and sundry belonging to the churches of England and Scotland when a stray pedlar joined his party and asked of his honour the favour of his protection as far as Stirling, urging as a reason the uncertainty of the times and the value of the property he carried in his pack. The pedlar, by agreeing with all that was said and desiring further information upon spiritual matters, soon took the attention of Captain Gifted Gilfillan from his prisoner. He declared that he had even visited near Mauchline the very farm of the Whig leader. He congratulated him upon the fine breed of cattle he possessed. Then he went on to speak of the many evil, popish, and unchristian things he had seen in his travels as a pedlar over the benighted countries of Europe. Whereupon Gifted Gilfillan became so pleased with his companion and so enraptured with his subject that he allowed his party to string itself out along the route without an attempt at discipline, or even the power of supporting each other in case of attack. The leaders were ascending a little hill covered with whin bushes and crowned with low brushwood when, after looking about him quickly to note some landmarks, the pedlar put his fingers to his mouth and whistled. He explained that he was whistling on a favourite dog named Bawdy which he had lost. The Covenanter reproved him severely for thinking of a useless dog in the midst of such precious and improving conversation as they were holding together. But in spite of his protests, the pedlar persisted in his whistling, and presently, out of a copse close to the path, 6 or 8 stout Highlanders sprang upon them, brandishing their claymores. "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon!" shouted Gifted Gilfillan, nothing daunted, and he was proceeding to lay about him stoutly when the pedlar, snatching a musket, felled him to the ground with the butt. The scattered Whig party hurried up to support their leader. In the scuffle, Edward's horse was shot, and he himself somewhat bruised in falling. Whereupon, some of the Highlanders took him by the arms, and half supported, half carried him away from the high road, leaving the unconscious Gifted still stretched on the ground. The Westlanders, thus deprived of a leader, did not even attempt a pursuit, but contented themselves with sending a few dropping shots after the Highlanders, which, of course, did nobody any harm. They carried Edward fully 2 miles, and it was not until they reached the deep covert of a distant glen that they stopped with their burden. Edward spoke to them repeatedly, but the only answer he got was that they had no English. Even the mention of the name of Vickian Vor, which had hitherto regarded as a talisman, produced no response. Moreover, Edward could see from the tartans of his captors that they were not of the clan either. Nor did the hut into which they presently conveyed our hero reveal any more. Edward was placed in a large bed, planked all round, and after his bruises were attended to by an old woman, the sliding panel was shut upon him. A kind of fever set his ideas wandering, and sometimes he fancied that he heard the voice of Flora MacIver speaking in the hut without. He tried to push back the panel, but the inmates had secured it on the outside with a large nail. Waverley remained some time in these narrow quarters, ministered to by the old woman, and at intervals hearing the same gentle girlish voice speaking outside, without, however, being able to see its owner. At last, after several days, 2 of the Highlanders who had first captured him returned, and by signs informed him that he must get ready to follow them immediately. At this news, Edward, thoroughly tired of his confinement, rejoiced, and upon rising found himself sufficiently well to travel. He was seated in the smoky cottage quietly waiting for the signal of departure when he felt a touch on his arm, and turning, he found himself face to face with Alice, the daughter of Donald Bean Lean. With a quick movement she showed him the edges of a bundle of papers, which she as swiftly concealed. She then laid her fingers on her lips and glided away to assist old Janet, his nurse, in packing his saddle-bags. With the tail of his eye, however, Edward saw the girl fold the papers among his linen without being observed by the others. This being done, she took no further notice of him whatever, except that just at the last, as she was leaving the cottage, she turned round and gave him a smile and a nod of farewell. The tall Highlander who was to lead the party now made Edward understand that there was considerable danger on the way. He must follow without noise, and do so exactly as he was bidden. A steel pistol and a broadsword were given to him for use in case of attack. The party had not been long upon its night journeying, moving silently through the woods and copses in Indian file, before Edward found that there was good reason for this precaution. At no great distance he heard the cry of an English sentinel. "All's well!" Again and again the cry was taken up by other sentries till the sound was lost in the distance. The enemy was very near, but the trained senses of the Highlanders in their own rugged country were more than a match for the discipline of the regulars. A little farther on they passed a large building with lights still twinkling in the windows. Presently the Highlander stood up and sniffed. Then, motioning Waverley to do as he did, he began to crawl on all fours toward a low and ruinous sheepfold. With some difficulty Edward obeyed, and with so much care that the stalk conducted that presently, looking over a stone wall, he could see an outpost of 4 or 6 soldiers lying round their campfire, while in front a sentinel paced backward and forward, regarding the heavens and whistling Nancy Dawson as placidly as if he were 100 miles from any wild rebel Highlandman. At that moment, the moon, which up to this time had been hidden behind clouds, shone out clear and bright. So Edward and his Highland guide had perforce to remain where they were, stuck up against the dike, not daring to continue their journey in the full glare of light, while the Highlander muttered curses on MacFarlane's lantern, as he called the moon. At last, the Highlander, motioning Edward to stay where he was, began with infinite pains to worm his way backward on all fours, taking advantage of every bit of cover, lying stock still behind a boulder while the sentry was looking in his direction, and again crawling swiftly to a more distant bush as often as he turned his back or marched the other way. Presently Edward lost sight of the Highlander, but before long he came out again in an altogether different part of the thicket, in full view of the sentinel, at whom he immediately fired a shot, the bullet wounding the soldier on the arm, stopping once and for all the whistling of Nancy Dawson. Then all the soldiers, awakened by the shot and their comrade's cry, advanced alertly toward the spot where the tall man had been seen. He had, however, retired, but continued to give them occasionally such a view of his figure in the open moonlight as to lead them yet farther from the path. Meanwhile, taking advantage of their leader's ruse, Waverley and his attendants made good speed over the heather till they got behind a rising ground, from which, however, they could still hear the shouts of the pursuers, and the more distant roll of the royal drums beating to arms. They had not gone far before they came upon an encampment in a hollow. Here several Highlanders with a horse or 2 lay concealed. They had not arrived very long before the tall Highlander, who had led the soldiers such a dance, made his appearance quite out of breath, but laughing gaily at the ease with which he had tricked his pursuers. Edward was now mounted on a stout pony, and the whole party set forward at a good round pace, accompanied by the Highlanders as an escort. They continued without molestation all the night, till in the morning light they saw a tall old castle on the opposite bank of the river, upon the battlements of which they could see the plaid and targe of a Highland sentry, and over which floated the white banner of the exiled Stuarts. They passed through a small town, and presently were admitted into the courtyard of the ancient fortress, where Edward was courteously received by a chief in full dress and wearing a white cockade. He showed Waverley directly to a half-ruinous apartment where, however, there was a small camp bed. Here he was about to leave him, after asking what refreshment he would take, when Edward, who had had enough of the mysteries, requested that he might be told where he was. "You're in the castle of Doune, in the district of Menteith," said the governor of the castle, "and you're in no danger whatever. I command here for His Royal Highness Prince Charles." At last it seemed to Waverley as if he had reached a place of rest and safety. But it was not to be. On the very next day he was put in charge of a detachment of irregular horsemen who were making their way eastward to join the forces of the prince. The leader of this band was no other than the Laird of Bamowapple, who, backing words by deeds, had mustered his grooms and huntsmen in the cause of the Stuarts. Edward attempted to speak civilly to him, but found himself brutally repulsed. Captain Falconer of Bamowapple had no ways forgotten the shrewd pinch in the sword-arm which he had received from the Baron of Bradwardine in Waverley's quarrel. At first, Edward had better luck with his lieutenant, a certain horse-copper or dealer. This man had sold Bamowapple the chargers upon which to mount his motley array, and, seeing no chance of getting his money except by going out himself, he had accepted the post of lieutenant in the Chevalier's army. So far, good. But just at the moment when it seemed that our hero was about to get some information of a useful sort, Bamowapple rode up and demanded of his lieutenant if he had not heard his orders that no one should speak to the prisoner. After that, they marched in silence, till, as the little company of adventurers was passing Stirling Castle, Bamowapple must needs sound his trumpet and display his white banner. This bravado, considerably to that gentleman's discomfiture, was answered at once by a burst of smoke from the castle, and the next moment a cannon-ball knocked up the earth a few feet from the captain's charger, and covered Bamowapple himself with dirt and stones. An immediate retreat of the command took place without having been specially ordered. As they approached Edinburgh, they could see that white wreaths of smoke encircled the castle. The cannonade rolled continuously. Bamowapple, however, warned by what had happened at Stirling, gave the castle a wide berth, and finally, without having entered the city, he delivered up his prisoner at the door of the ancient palace of Holyrood. And so, for the time being, Edward's adventures in the wild Highlands were ended. And that is the fourth tale from Waverley. Here and there among the heather, indeed, we get to see as Edward goes traveling about, is confronted with his supposed treason, which I'm sure we'll learn more about later, as well as finding himself back face to face with Bamowapple, the scoundrel from earlier in the story. And this is really heating up, isn't it? It's such a fun and exciting story at this point, and as you'll see in the next story, the children are taking to it as well. An interlude of sticking plaster. This is Dan Scholz for the Folktale Project. Don't forget that you can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, Overcast, anywhere you like to get your podcasts. You can follow us on Twitter at Folktale Project. You can find us on Auto Radio, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, Spotify, anywhere you like to listen. And you can always head over to folktaleproject.com, where you'll find a new story waiting for you every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. As always, thank you so much for listening.